Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are diving straight into a fascinating framework-level clash between mainstream evolutionary biology and creation-side biology. And understanding this clash isn't just about the biology itself, it actually reframes one of the absolute biggest cultural debates of our time. If you've ever watched these two sides argue and felt like they're just completely talking past each other, well, you're definitely not alone. So we're going to lay out exactly where they agree, where they diverge, and how they can look at the exact same scientific data and walk away with fundamentally different conclusions. Let's get into it. Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to parse the three meanings of evolution, visualize the tree versus the orchard, test the boundaries using genetics and the fossil record, tackle the human question, review the mainstream evidence, and finally, look at frameworks versus facts.
Section 1. Three meanings of evolution. Parsing the terminology.
Okay, so part of what makes this whole conversation so slippery is that the word evolution is quietly out there doing three very different jobs. Philosopher of science Stephen Meyer breaks evolution down into three distinct meanings. Step 1 is simply change over time, just the observed fact that populations shift. Step 2 is universal common descent, which is the historical claim that literally all life traces back to one single ancestor. And step 3 is the unguided mechanism, the idea that mutation and natural selection alone produced absolutely everything. Now here's the kicker. It turns out almost no one, and I mean including young Earth biologists, disputes that first step. You can totally accept step 1 without buying into steps 2 or 3. This is absolutely crucial to state clearly because it's the one piece that the popular debate almost always skips over. Young Earth biologists fully agree that species change over time. For instance, biologist Todd Wood points to things we can actually observe, like Galapagos finch beaks adapting to different seasons, or desert oryxes changing their coat colors to mess with predator visibility. As Wood points out, natural selection and random variation can do amazing things. I mean, think about it. Wolves can become Great Danes and Chihuahuas within just a few hundred years of selective breeding. So the claim from the creation side isn't that variation doesn't happen, it's that this observed variation has a hard ceiling. Basically, finches stay finches and dogs stay dogs. Section 2. The tree versus the orchard. Visualizing the frameworks. So if they don't accept a single universal tree, what's the creationist alternative? It's a model called baraminology. The word actually comes from the Hebrew words bara, meaning create, and men, meaning kind. In this model, life stems from a limited number of original kinds, but each one is front-loaded with this built-in capacity for diversification. It's kind of like a Swiss Army knife, right? Packed with genetic tools that just pop out as needed depending on the environment. And this concept actually solves a huge practical puzzle for that framework, how Noah's Ark could possibly house all the animals. If the base created unit sits mostly at the family level of modern taxonomy, meaning just one pair of felines, one pair of canines, and so on, well, the Ark only needed to hold a couple of thousand kinds. Those base animals then radiated post-flood into the millions of species we see running around today. And this brings us to a brilliant visual for the core difference between these two views. Mainstream biology looks at life and sees the universal tree of life, one massive, continuous branching trunk where every living thing on Earth connects back to a single common ancestor. Creationists, on the other hand, see an orchard of kinds. They see a forest of totally separate trees standing side by side. In the orchard model, there is a deep underlying catness that unites lions, tigers, and your house cat on one single tree. But felines and whales, they don't share a trunk at all. They are completely separate trees in the orchard.
Section 3. Testing the boundaries. Genetics and the fossil record.
Now, you might be wondering, how do we actually know where the boundary of a tree ends? Well, the discontinuity argument leans pretty heavily on sudden bursts in the fossil record. We're talking about whole groups showing up abruptly and then persisting largely unchanged. We see this with the very first turtles, the first flowering plants, and of course the famous Cambrian explosion. But to be completely fair about the challenges on the creation side, kind is not a formal taxonomic rank. There isn't a universally agreed upon, easily testable definition for it yet. Usually boundary lines are drawn using hybridization, like can they breed, and morphology. And as a really interesting peek behind the curtain, creationist researchers like Todd Wood openly admit that pinpointing the exact boundary of a kind is very much a work in progress. Those lines can and absolutely do shift around as new data rolls in.
Then we get to the genetic tests in man. This one is fascinating. We've all heard about the famous 98% genetic similarity between humans and chimps, right? Which, as a quick aside, geneticists note is actually a bit lower and way messier when you factor in unique genomic regions. But it's almost always presented as a total slam dunk for common ancestry. Here's the wild part, though. Before the chimp genome was ever sequenced, both frameworks successfully predicted high similarity. The evolutionary framework predicted it because of a recent shared ancestor, but the creation framework also predicted it because both are land mammals built from a shared biochemical toolkit. Because both sides predicted the outcome, geneticists point out that this specific data point is essentially a genuine toss-up. It's totally compatible with common ancestry, but it's also compatible with common design. It's a great reminder to always pause and ask what a specific data point actually proves.
Now, a much sharper prediction test shows up when we look at population genetics. Modern humans carry unusually low genetic diversity. Mainstream genetics accommodates this fact by pointing to ancient bottlenecks that occurred hundreds of thousands of years ago. But the young Earth model? It predicts specific, highly rapid bottlenecks directly from the Genesis text. It predicts a first bottleneck of exactly 2 people, a second bottleneck of 8 people at the flood, followed by a massively rapid expansion. You can literally calculate exactly 32 named grandchildren within a couple of generations. The big takeaway here is that while both models can accommodate the low diversity finding, the young Earth model is highly distinctive because it specified the size, the timing, and the pace of the population recovery in advance, directly based on the text.
Section 4, the human question. Where do we draw the line?
When this created kinds thinking turns to the fossil record, where exactly do they draw the line for humanity? Surprisingly enough, researchers like Todd Wood look at the skeletal and genetic data and place Neanderthals firmly, clearly on the human side of the line. In this framework, Neanderthals aren't some other species. They are simply another instance of physical variety within the surviving humankind adapting after the flood. Australopithecines, by contrast, are placed completely outside that boundary, categorized purely as non-human primates.
But why draw the line right there? Well, for the creation model, human uniqueness carries a heavy theological weight that goes way beyond just biology. They define humanity by the image of God, which is a spiritual and relational quality involving language, abstract reasoning, and deep moral responsibility. Ultimately, this boils down to a theological claim. It's something that skeletal or genetic data alone simply can't adjudicate. It sits downstream of a theological commitment. And frankly, if you don't share that starting point, you are naturally going to look at the exact same skulls and read them very differently.
Section 5. The mainstream evidence. The case for extensive common ancestry.
Now, to be perfectly clear and fair, the mainstream case is built on some deeply compelling data, and this explainer isn't going to pretend to otherwise. In comparative genomics, we find things like shared broken retroviral insertions. These are essentially ancient genetic mistakes, sitting at the exact matching locations in the genomes of related species. That is highly, highly difficult to explain except as inheritance from a shared ancestor. In the fossil record, we have incredibly well-documented transitional forms like Tiktaalik, which beautifully bridges the gap between fish and tetrapods. And we even have observed speciation, where new species arise in real time, right in front of us, like chromosome doubling in plants creating a brand new species in a single generation. Make no mistake, this is a robust, highly serious case for extensive common ancestry.
Section 6. Frameworks, not just facts. Interpreting the data. When you lay it all out like this, it's wild how much both sides actually agree on, far more than the popular debate ever suggests. Both sides agree that species change. Both sides agree natural selection is real and undeniably powerful. Both sides agree humans and chimps share a high genetic similarity. Listen to this. A baraminologist and an evolutionary biologist can look at the exact same feline family tree, examine all the same data, and agree on every single branch. The debate is entirely about the framework they are using to read the limits of that data. The true fundamental disagreement is simply whether the individual trees of life eventually connect back into a single trunk or if they stand totally alone in an orchard. So the underlying pattern here isn't a dispute over what the raw data shows, it's a dispute over which framework that data gets right into before the conclusions are drawn. And as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this question to ponder before we tackle our next topic. What makes human creativity, our search for meaning, and our moral reasoning different in kind from absolutely anything else in the animal world? Because trying to understand the limits of biology inevitably brings us right back to the boundary that may matter most, the profound mystery of ourselves. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning.